Welcome to episode 13 of Mental Mastery, where I interview the world's greatest minds on what it takes to live a happy and successful life. I'm your host, Max Weig, and today I'm joined by one of the world's foremost experts on goal setting and grit, Caroline Adams Miller. After overcoming an eating disorder in her 20s, Caroline dedicated herself to helping others live their best lives. In addition to getting her master's in applied positive psychology, she's written 6 books, including Creating Your Best Life and Getting Grit, which has been named one of the 10 books that will change your life in 2017. Caroline has also mastered grit in her own life and used it to recover from bulimia, become a top-ranked master swimmer, and receive a black belt in Hapkido. So, Caroline, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me. Love your topic.
I'm so excited for this. And actually, one of the most fascinating things while researching you was that you actually cultivated and studied grit long before it was this sexy phenomenon or movement that it is now. So what was the moment in your life that kind of you realized that, hey, I have to develop more grit or mental toughness in my life?
Well, those might be 2 separate questions. So I never thought about what you just said, but I was lucky to be exposed to Angela Duckworth before Angela Duckworth became a worldwide phenomenon. So I did return to school in 2005. I was one of the first 34 people to get a master's degree in applied positive psychology at the University of Pennsylvania. So I studied with Martin Seligman and other world leaders in the science of flourishing, and that happened to coincide with Angela Duckworth working with Marty as his PhD student on this quality, this X factor that she had discovered in her work with students and I guess primarily students, that the most intelligent ones, the ones with the most resources, were not the most successful. So she began to unpack this X factor. What is it that causes some people to rise to the top and persist and persevere, particularly in challenging circumstances, without quitting? And what do the other people lack? So she was running in and out of classrooms while I was studying at Penn in that one year, 2005, 2006. That was also when I discovered that there were no mass market books that included goal setting theory. So my capstone project that year was the world's first evidence-based mass market book on how to set and accomplish goals with goal setting theory and science and how it intersects with the science of flourishing. So I did include a chapter on her new work at that time before the mass market had access to her. In 2009, that book came out with a chapter on grit. And so that was when I discovered grit, and as it's being called, grit in air quotes. So that's one moment. And then I devoted the next 8 years to just studying how do you get grit, not just it's important, but how do you get it? My realization that I didn't have that quality, which I now had a name for, was in my early 20s when I hit my last bottom at a hopeless moment, really, for anyone who had an eating disorder in 1984. And I had to figure out how to save my life from bulimia, because all we knew is that people were hopeless. They didn't know. Nobody knew how to get better. Nobody knew anyone who had gotten better. It was a big black void. And I was fortunate to be in an environment where I met one person in recovery, and that started me off on a journey to getting better, but giving it away so that other people could get better too. And this is the last thing I'll say. In hindsight, what I realized is all the things I had to do and think and master to get into recovery and stay in recovery, I now recognize were grit. So I had talent and success. What I didn't have was grit until I hit my last bottom with this eating disorder.
Wow, that is so fascinating. So you said you met a person that kind of helped you out of that. So what is it that they said to you that helped you realize that really shifted your life from then on?
So it's become apocryphal now in some ways, but the story is this. In 1984, I was at a 12-step meeting for compulsive eaters, and a woman who looked very much like me, she was tall and blonde, and she looked healthy, and she just stood up to share her story at this meeting of compulsive eaters. And it wasn't just an eating disorder group. I didn't even know that eating disorders were part of it. I just knew that food would be discussed there, and I knew food was a problem. And she just said, "My name is Betsy, and I'm recovering one day at a time from bulimia." And that sentence had all the words and all the inflections that made me have hope, because I thought, if that woman who I can relate to has overcome bulimia one day at a time, and she looks to me like she's not fibbing, she looks like she's got the health that's missing, the hope, the light in her soul. If she can get better, I can too. And it changed the course of my life to be in that meeting that night. And I did end up writing the first book by anybody who got better from bulimia and lived to tell the story. And that book came out in 1988. And that's really when the course of my life changed, because I didn't expect what happened after that. But I was really just going to give away what had been given to me so freely, and that was hope.
Wow, that's such a powerful story. I love that, how you kind of learned from her and then took it and shared it with other people to help them get through those hard times. I love that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think it's the mitzvah everyone has to give to others. If you've been given something of value, I heard something really wonderful in those rooms, and that was, you can't keep what you don't give away. And I realized that if I wanted to stay in recovery and keep getting better, I had to turn around and give it away to someone else who didn't yet have it. And I've really tried to live my life by that principle, whether I'm talking about goal setting or grit or eating disorder recovery or all of the above. You have to give away the important knowledge and mindset tools and everything else to other people, because it reinforces its importance to yourself. So you can't keep what you don't give away. And that's how I live.
And so kind of holding yourself accountable by being this role model, right? Like showing other people, like kind of leading the way. And that's how you use to kind of hold yourself accountable as well and make sure that you still follow through.
That's a good way of saying it. I didn't see myself as a role model at the time, because it was all done in anonymous rooms. But I guess as you look at it and unpack it, you can say you almost become a role model whether you want to or not. And that's a heavy responsibility. And it's one that I think too many people in the eating disorder world, maybe in other worlds as well, are too quick to embrace the mantle of role model. So they'll go public about all kinds of things before they have the rock solid strength and recovery and grit that will allow them to stay in recovery regardless of what knocks them off their base. And so I really do believe there's been a rush to selfie grit. You know, look at me, I did something hard, but I got to talk about it. I think people need to wait for that moment before they choose to go public. I think privately is another story, but I see too many people who want the mantle of role model before they're ready to actually embrace all that entails.
Oh, for sure, for sure. Yeah, so true. So one of the things that you talk about a lot is this culture of average that we have in our society nowadays. So what do you mean by that?
Oh boy, I wonder if is this true in Germany? Do you relate to what I'm talking about?
I think it's true everywhere, really, and probably all developed countries at least.
I think you're right. I watched as my children grew up, and they're all they're in their 20s, upper to lower 20s. So I've got 3 adult children, boy, girl, boy, and they were being raised right in the nexus of this self-esteem parenting movement in the United States, which I agree was kind of this broad, make your children happy at all costs, tell them that they're winners, tell them that they're successful, even if they've just done a tiny fraction of work required to be excellent, because if you do that, they'll be happy. And if they're happy, my God, then they're going to be successful and they're going to have confidence. And, the opposite is true. When you praise people when they haven't done the requisite work to be that person, to be excellent, they become so enamored of themselves that, the research shows that you create a lot of narcissism and sociopathy. So it doesn't create hard work. You develop a fixed mindset where you're afraid to lose the praise. So, and you also don't know what it takes to be excellent, because you're so used to being praised for mediocrity. So that became a cultural phenomenon where there was just so much mediocrity that was called awesome that I think we have an entire generation of young adults, and it's not their fault. I want to quickly say it's not their fault that society changed around them and playgrounds became places where there were plastic structures that nobody was excited to play on. No risk taking, no thrills, no sledding, no playing tag at school, no races where there's real winners. Everybody's a winner. So mediocrity became the norm, and great inflation went right along with it. And then along with it came anxiety and comfort animals and all the things that have now created a culture where I don't think kids realize how much they can really ask of themselves. I think they long to know what does it take to be great, but I don't think they've met that moment where they're willing to push themselves. Not all of them, of course, but the majority of them don't always know how to sit with discomfort long enough to find out what you're made of.
Oh, for sure. I think one of the biggest struggles for people in my generation is there's so little like adversity for most of us. Like there's it's so easy, to get into school and kind of go through school and just kind of get through the day. It's so easy. Like there's no real obstacles anymore. There's no big challenges. And I think that's what holds people back really from developing true confidence, is like they don't have anything every day that they can do they can actually draw that confidence from. Instead, they kind of are told like, here's so great, you're so great, everything is good. But they don't really accomplish anything. They don't really do anything, right?
Well, and I think deep down, people know that they haven't done anything. And we do know from research that at the end of the day, you scan your day for what you're proud of, and you do it in a subconscious way. And we all do it. But the problem is that the things that make us confident, that give us real self-esteem, aren't the things we just want. It's the things we did outside of our comfort zone. So if you're not waking up and doing hard things and pushing yourself to pursue meaningful goals, then at the end of the day, you will, whether you know it or not, rank your day as mediocre. And consequently, you will begin to see yourself as mediocre, even if you don't admit it to anybody else, because the world may be telling you you're great just the way you are. But there's a lot of dissonance between what people experience and know about the adversity they've had and what they've overcome and who their friends are and what their strengths are and what they have when the chips are down and they've got to show up at all costs. I think people know they either have it or don't have it, regardless of what the outside world tells them. So it's better to get in line with knowing with certainty what you're made of and what matters to you and what you're willing to put your heart and your pride on the line for publicly, because then you really grow up having a sense of how to measure your life in a meaningful way.
Oh, I love that. I definitely agree. I think deep down inside, we all know, like at the end of the day, like you said, we all know if we gave it our best or not, right? Even though the world may be telling us, hey, you're so successful, like we may have that talent and initial skill, but deep down inside, I think we always know if we actually gave it our best, if we actually did everything to improve. So
we do, and so many people don't even have goals, though, Max. That's what's so interesting, is the research shows that most people are just being reactive to what they didn't do yesterday or things that other people are doing that they pick up on. So being proactive is something that only the minority of us do, maybe 20%. And we also know that the happiest people do wake up every day to clear-cut goals, hard goals, not just, short-term easy goals, hard goals, leverage goals, goals that will allow you to feel like you left it all on the floor, that you lived your life on a stage. It wasn't someone else's life. And so the problem is that as much as we know about how much it matters to be that person, very few people are choosing to be that person. And that's why I've issued this clarion call to the world: do hard things. If I have to sum this up with one phrase, it's do hard things, but do hard things that are meaningful, that also in some ways make the world or other people's lives better as well.
Awesome. And I mean, that was really the perfect introduction to authentic grit, your own kind of take on what grit is. So can you tell me a little bit more about authentic grit, what it is?
Sure. So let me connect it to Angela's work first. So Angela won a MacArthur Genius Grant Award for her research on grit, and she defines it as passion and persistence in pursuit of long-term goals. And I think that's a very standard definition that many people understand. But because I work with people, I'm not a researcher necessarily. I work with people and I study human nature, and I think, okay, so if grit is so important and it's called the secret to success, and the hardest goals are what allow people to measure their life in meaningful ways and know what they're made of, how do you actually get the kind of grit that makes life better? And I realized that I had to come up with a new definition that I call authentic grit. And what that means to me is that when you're in the presence of somebody who has this kind of grit, which means passionately pursuing hard goals, outside of your comfort zone, taking positive risks in order to live your best life, in the process of doing that, whether you are choosing to have this impact or not, you are awing and inspiring other people to want to be better as well. So this kind of grit is about good grit in the pursuit of the right goals, but in the process of pursuing those goals, people can't help but be brushed or impacted by being around it. And they ask themselves, what if I played bigger in life? What if I had those kinds of goals? What if I was willing to put my ego on the line to see if I had, the humility to learn from other people so that I could become the best? And so good grit uplifts and inspires people, whereas bad grit diminishes people. And I have 3 different kinds of bad grit that we can go into if you'd like. But really, grit is only good when it's used in the right ways for the right reason, in the right circumstances, and in that process uplifts the collective and makes other people better as well.
Oh, I love this kind of take on grit. And really when you say authentic, what it makes me think of is just kind of being true to yourself and making sure that the goals that you're chasing are actually your own, are actually goals that kind of light you on fire, right? That like make you want to do amazing things in your life. And I think that's what so many people are missing, is that they choose chasing goals that aren't necessarily true to themselves. So why do you think it is that so many people wake up every morning and do things that don't make them feel alive?
That's a really good question. I think people choose to live that way for a lot of different reasons. One could be that we don't want to disappoint ourselves. We don't want to set ourselves up to fail. We don't want the truth at times, or the data that would tell us that we're not measuring up. So we'll set squishy goals or vague goals, things that we know we can do without too much effort. So we stay inside our comfort zone. And some of that is being attributed to this whole fixed mindset kind of condition that Carol Dweck at Stanford talks about, which is when you're overpraised and you don't want to lose that praise or that opinion of yourself, you won't go out of your comfort zone to risk failure. So you don't have what's called a growth mindset. So I think one of the reasons people don't find out what they're made of is they don't want to risk losing face, not being praised, not being seen as excellent to yourself or other people. So I think people end up being protective of their egos. That's one. I think there's other reasons as well. I think some people just aren't curious. They aren't curious about life, about finding out what other people are doing. How much can I learn here? There isn't a lot of humility in our society these days. And there's two kinds of humility. And if you lack social humility or intellectual humility, you'll be a know-it-all, or you won't be willing to let someone else be the star of a conversation or teach you something. The greatest athletes we know have humility because they want to find out what they're made of on other people's best days as well. They want to learn from losing if necessary. And so they're always willing to be shown up by people who are better than them so that they can really find out, where do I measure up? How do I know if I'm truly playing my best game here? So I think in this culture where people are filming themselves, posting pictures, there's this epidemic of young girls who just have to post pictures with less and less clothing on, bikinis. And I mean, I just see girls in my family as well, unfortunately doing the same thing, where in my extended family, where the more clothing that comes off on Instagram, which is the social media channel, which, makes people most unhappy, the more likes they get. So they're chasing likes. They're chasing other people validating them instead of validating themselves. So those are just a few reasons right there.
I love that. I think especially the point about the growth mindset that you're making is so important, because I think most people just aren't willing to kind of fail in public, right? Like failing in private, I think for most people is fine, but failing in public, like failing in front of your classmates, in front of your teachers, in front of your mentors, it's painful, right? And I think that's what most people are afraid of. So
I'm curious about something. I have to ask you a question. When you're in the presence of people who are going for it publicly, putting their ego on the line, are you excited to watch it?
Honestly, I am. Yes, I think because that's when the kind of magic happens, right? That's when you actually get better, because when you're into your comfort zone, when you're doing things that are just normal, like you don't get any better, right? You don't learn anything new by doing the same 2 + 2 every day, right? Like at some point you have to learn new things, you have to grow. And so I think that's so important, choosing to really put yourself out there and do things that you're uncomfortable with.
Well, we know that grit is contagious. I mean, that's what's so interesting to me, is that being in an environment where other people are doing that little extra more to become their best selves, they're persisting a little bit longer, sometimes 10 minutes longer in the process of deliberate practice, is what I think a lot of people know about. They won't just be active, they'll be productive in the ways in which they pursue their goals. But we know that quality, those behaviors, that mindset, it's all contagious. And so I think about something like Dancing with the Stars, which is a big show here in the US, where you watch people who don't know how to dance learning to dance on national television. They're judged. It's not like you're dancing for fun, you're being judged. I mean, there's a judging.
The pressure is high.
Right. And I think people love to watch these kinds of things. We love to watch, America's Got Talent or Britain's Got Talent or whatever it is, because we love to see people having everything on the line, and we're inspired by it. And that's the right kind of grit, is it inspires us to say, wow, what if I did something like that? You know, what would my life be like? So you want to be around people who are doing that.
Oh, for sure. And I mean, that's exactly what the reason why I kind of started this podcast, to kind of chat and hang out with people like you and just people doing amazing things. And just to kind of take it back to what you said before, I think surrounding yourself with those people, like in an athletic team, for example, I run a lot, right? And so whenever I run with other people, like all of a sudden there's a spirit of energy and excitement, right? And all of a sudden everyone runs faster. Everyone can do more and achieve more because you kind of feed off of each other's enthusiasm and energy. So I think that's so important.
Well, there's something to be said about that. I don't know if you're a runner, you might have heard of Shalini Flanagan and the Shalini effect. Okay. So what I love about Shalini Flanagan is that, you know, according to all the news reports I've read, she bucked the trend of training alone. And she instead created a training group, I think, in Oregon, where she invited her competitors, not just her friends, her competitors, to come train with her. And she became the person who held them all together. And I call it relational grit. When you're in relationships where you support each other and sculpt each other with feedback about your goals, and you see people the way they want to be seen, and you support them when they're down or want to quit. But one thing about Shalini Flanagan that came out after she won the New York City Marathon, not this last year, but the previous year, is that everyone who came to train with her in this training group actually achieved personal bests, which doesn't always happen. So there are good groups that train together, and there are people who have a bad apple in their midst. And I've seen, you know, teams get completely cratered by someone who has a huge ego. They're not a team player. The same thing in business, you know, hire slow, fire fast is one of the famous phrases about get these people out of your group, because they will be a toxic cancer that will infect and spread and hurt everybody. So it has to be the right training group.
Oh, for sure, for sure. I think especially high ground, like if you think about running, for example, I mean, Kenyan runners are like probably the best like kind of runners in the whole world, right? And if you look at like a small town like Eden, Kenya, where all of these amazing runners come from, I mean, it's a small town, and yet all the best athletes in the world go there to train, and like from all over the world they fly there to put themselves in this environment of excellence, right? Where every day you run with these world record holders and Olympic champions, and simply by putting yourself into this environment and putting yourself around people that doing amazing things, I think is so powerful.
Well, so that's self-efficacy theory right there. That's Albert Bandura's work, where the muscle of goal accomplishment is having self-efficacy, which is the belief I can do these hard things. I haven't yet done them, but I'll find a way. So when you have self-efficacy, it's said you have the muscle of goal accomplishment. And there are 4 ways to build self-efficacy. And one of the ways to do that is to have proximal role models. And so when you put yourself in an environment where you see people doing routinely the things that you long to be able to do, it becomes possible to you. You begin to believe that you have what it takes because you see these people and you can relate to them. And so there are 4 different ways to build self-efficacy. That way, I can see is incredibly important for people who need to immerse themselves in this culture of doing hard things and being excellent. So it's got grit components, it's got self-efficacy components, but I do think people in general do better when they're around people who are pushing them past their limits. And I think that's why at the end of crew races, people are passing out, vomiting off the side of the boat. They push themselves beyond anything they've ever pushed themselves to do, their bodies, because they're doing it because they're part of a team and they can't stop. So that's fascinating to me to watch the end of a crew race. My daughter rode crew, and so I became fascinated by how people could go above and beyond for their teammates, maybe not for themselves.
Wow, that's so cool. Now, one really interesting thing about authentic grit that you shared was this kind of ordinary grit, because I think when most people think about grit, is they kind of think like, I have to run like a marathon like every second weekend, or you have to like do these superhuman feats, right? But grit can happen in any ordinary situation. So can you share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that there's several kinds of good grit. And let's talk about the bad grit, if you don't mind, so that people know.
Oh, for sure.
In a minute. But I want to focus on this good grit for a moment, because I think you can, and there are stories in my book, Getting Grit, of Olympians, and I call it Mount Olympus grit, where you push your body past all, reasonable standards, but you're finding out what you're made of. I mean, that's even Alex Honnold, the man who free climbed El Capitan at Yosemite, I think within the last year or two. I mean, he did something extraordinary, but it's not just Olympians. It's people like that doing extraordinary things. That's Mount Olympus grit. Then you've got celebrity grit. You've got, people like Oprah Winfrey and J.K. Rowling who are using their celebrity platforms to encourage people to do hard things and pursue their goals too. And then you also have there's celebrity grit, there's Mount Olympus grit, and blanking on my third kind of good grit, but ordinary grit is very important. And that's the fourth kind, which is just ordinary people doing extraordinary things in the process of just going through their day-to-day lives. And so when you're somebody who's just pursuing hard goals, it may not be hard to somebody else, but it's hard to you. You're working 2-3 jobs. You're raising a special needs child. You're going back to school in middle age because you never completed your high school degree. That kind of extraordinary grit to pursue something that is important to you, not to anyone else, and doing it without fanfare, without expecting a trophy or a pat on the head at the end of the day, just because it matters to you and it gives your life meaning and purpose. That kind of grit is, I think, what we're all looking to embody, but also embed in our lives, in our companies, in our teams, because these are the people who simply by walking amongst us make us all better people. And whenever I'm in the presence of somebody like that, I'm a better person for having witnessed them. If I could give you one example from my life, it didn't make it in my book, but in 2014, I was swimming in Masters Nationals at the University of Maryland, which is not far from where I live here. Near Washington, D.C. And this buzz started on the deck when this older woman slipped into the water, and the announcer announced the start of the 50-meter freestyle. And this woman had her hand on the side of the pool and a big smile on her face. And when she pushed off to start the 50-meter freestyle, this buzz increased and everybody got on their feet and was cheering for her. I found out that she was 99 years old, about to set a world record. I think she did. She was the high point winner of the meet. So she was in the 95 to 99-year-old category. She took up swimming at the age of 91. Her name's Annie Donovan. Now she's competing 100 to 104. My point is that woman is not famous necessarily, but she has this quality of ordinary grit. Doing hard things just because it matters to her. But we all got to our feet because we knew we were in the presence of greatness. And this greatness made us all better simply because we were there. And these are not people giving speeches. These aren't people looking to be heroic. But when we know their stories and we're curious about what other people are doing, what are you doing that's hard? We are uplifted and inspired by them too. And we all need to have examples of ordinary grit in our lives, but we also need to be that person as well.
Oh, for sure. I love what you're saying there. I think it's so powerful that just this realization, right? That like I can show grit too. Like I have all these things in my life where I can show grit, where I can show up, where I can be a role model. And even if I'm not famous, even if I'm not successful at anything, just by showing up to like the training run with your friends or just showing up and being a positive role model and encouraging other people, I think is oftentimes so much more powerful than even watching like celebrities on the news or on TV, whatever, just having those people in your life. So.
Well, see, that's why I think I'm alive, is that woman, Betsy, who stood up at that meeting and said, I'm in recovery one day at a time from bulimia. She had ordinary grit. She had already overcome something that was heroic at the time. I mean, I don't know how many people know this, but 30 years ago, it was a wasteland. Nobody got better. People died. Karen Carpenter, the singer, she died. And so this woman, by standing up and sharing her story, being my role model, she didn't know the significance she would have in my life by being there. But she did. And I think that kind of ordinary grit changes people's lives. The other kind of positive grit that I talk about is Mount Rushmore grit. Mount Rushmore's in South Dakota here, and we have 4 U.S. presidents, the greatest of our presidents. Their faces are sculpted in the side of this granite cliff. And I found that when I looked at history, all the turning points in history, I found that there stood a figure, a human being, a Malala Yousafzai, a Martin Luther King, a Mahatma Gandhi, who had a value and a vision of what could be for the world. And they stood up against the worst of men, of life. And it was how they stood up to those indignities and those setbacks that got them followers. And because of that, I call them having Mount Rushmore grit, but because of them, history changed. And so we have all these paragons of grit in our sporting world, in our history books, and we need to call them out. And we need to point out that's grit right there. That grit, that changed history, and it changes people's lives. And this is a quality we really need to get back to cultivating, identifying and cultivating, because I think it's gone MIA in our world. I think things are slowly going back to that. I think we're recognizing the importance of not just resilience. It's not enough to be resilient, to be gritty. Grit is above and beyond resilience. It's that special factor that allows you to keep going, not just short term, but long term. And it's passionate goals. It's things that light you up, that keep you going in the dark night of the soul when nobody else believes in you and your goals. Unfortunately, there are 3 kinds of bad grit I've identified that we have to steer clear of. And I can tell you what those are if you want to know.
Oh, yeah, please.
Okay, so the first one, I think everybody gets a chuckle out of this, is stupid grit. So stupid grit is what I illustrate with a picture of a climber whose body's at the top of Mount Everest. He's just known as Green Boots because his body cannot be brought down from the summit of Mount Everest. So in mountaineering, it's called summit fever. And you become drunk on getting to the top, regardless of what's going on. You know, avalanche, Sherpa's telling you it's time to go, you know, descend. It's not safe. You know, people with summit fever have stupid grit because it's about getting there at all costs, whether you hurt yourself or somebody else. And so you see this constantly among entrepreneurs who get drunk on their vision of what their product or their company can do, but they don't pivot in time when the situation has changed around them. So there is stupid grit. People hit the wall. It's marked by a lack of humility. They don't listen to other people. They don't seek guidance, but they're arrogant and kind of drunk on the vision of what they can be. A second kind of grit is faux grit. And those are people who don't do hard things, but they want you to believe they did. And so they will fake their accomplishments. They will take performance enhancing drugs. They will fake the research for their PhDs. They will take shortcuts. I mean, but they want the world to think that they did something hard. And the most egregious thing I found in writing Getting Grit was people who are pretending to be Medal of Honor winners, you know, the highest awards, you know, given by the military for the bravest among us. And there are only, I think, 76 living Medal of Honor winners in the US. There are people who buy it on eBay. They buy it, they wear it. You know, they're in parades. I mean, who does this? But it's people who are so desperate to be famous and well regarded that they'll take shortcuts. And the third and last kind is selfie grit. And those are people who do hard things, but they want to tell you all the time about what they did, how they did it. It's all about them. They don't have humility. And so this self-aggrandizement that we see in the world that's so common is, I think, cheapening what grit could be. So you need to know the red flags of heading towards faux grit or fake grit, selfie grit, and stupid grit, because all of those will make a situation and other people worse, not better.
Yeah, it really sounds like your motives matter when you're trying to kind of build grit. Like, why are you actually doing what you're doing? Are you doing to impress other people or to just look good? Or are you actually trying to accomplish something in this world that is going to inspire other people, that is going to do amazing things, that's going to just improve your life, right? So it really comes down to, from understanding you correctly, just looking at what am I actually trying to get out of this?
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's an example in my book of a woman who won the Ironman championships in Canada, and she wanted people to admire her, to think of her as some great athlete. It wasn't about seeing what her body could do or the rest of it. So she would, if there were 2 loops in a marathon course, she would hide in a porta potty until she would slip out and then kind of rejoin the race. But when you think about someone like a Katie Ledecky, you know, who's really, she's on the cover of National Geographic magazine this month in the United States, and she's not swimming just to be the world champion. She's really out to remake the sport of swimming and change the way women see themselves as doing, you know, distance events. But how far can a female body go? How can she change the sport of swimming so it becomes more exciting to little kids who may not want to do a hard sport? So when you have bigger, bolder visions of what can happen as a result of you achieving these hard things, and not just look at me, which is very obvious. It has a flavor to it and a feeling to it that's very easy to pick up on. It's palpable around people who have that kind of, you know, vision for their lives. Again, it doesn't uplift anybody, and she doesn't have it. I happen to know her because she she lives in my neighborhood. I knew her father in college. And so I've noticed that she was a very, very little girl. And it's not about, look at me, Katie Ledecky. It's about, look at what we can do with this sport in this new way. Now that we've taken away these high-tech suits, look what we can do without the shortcuts of the high-tech suits and the other kind of, you know, things that people were doing to achieve world records without necessarily doing all the hard work. So that's, you're right. The motive really matters.
That's an incredible story. And I think one of the things that is really interesting is, at least from personal experience, I would say that not always, but oftentimes the people that are on like the very top of like their sport, they're actually very humble. They actually oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes approach the sport because of the right motives, to kind of give back, to push their bodies and their minds to see what they're actually capable of, rather than just kind of trying to prove to everyone else that, hey, I'm the best, right? So what it really comes down to is the growth mindset again. I think what you talked about before is learning to become the best rather than just kind of trying to show everyone else, hey, I'm the best.
And there's research on that. The best athletes are the most humble. So you're absolutely right. And that's one of the things I was able to get into Getting Grit that really defines these great athletes, is that it's about finding out how good they can be against the world's best, not about just being the best. And I read a wonderful book called Captain Class. And I think, I'm blanking on the guy's name, but it's a wonderful book, and it's about the greatest sports teams of all time and what was the difference maker in all those teams that allowed them to be set apart from other great teams in the same sport. And one of the things he found was it was the captain. The captain was the difference maker, and the captain was never somebody with selfie grit. It wasn't the Michael Jordans. It was the people who were like Richie McCaw, one of the greatest all-black rugby players of all time, who's still alive, obviously. He's a young man, but it's those humble athletes who become captains of teams that become the best, who really exemplify authentic grit and how it uplifts other people and doesn't diminish anybody.
Yeah, you know, that made me think. I've recently listened to an interview with oh gosh, now I'm blanking on the name. John Wooden, Coach Wooden, yeah. and he shared the story of, like, at the beginning of every season, what he would do with those like basic elite athletes, right? The first thing he would do is teach them how to tie their shoes, right? How to tie them, how to put them in the socks the right way so they're not wrinkly, so they don't get any blisters. So really like going down to the basics and being willing to just learn like even the smallest and simplest things. Something. I love that. I love that story. And really made me think.
It's such a good point, because when you do the basics and don't take shortcuts, like there's a thing about redshirting kindergartners in this country, so that when you go to kindergarten, you're 7 years old, not 5, so you can have this advantage, this physical and emotional maturity. When you skip all the basic steps, you never quite catch up because you're used to faux grit, essentially. And so what was I going to say about doing the basics right? Well, I'll come back to it, but you're absolutely right. It's about doing the little things. Oh, I know. It's Admiral McRaven's talk about the Navy SEALs in this country, one of our special forces. And he gave a talk called like 10 Things to Do to Change the World. It's an 18-minute TED Talk that is phenomenal. And it starts with make your bed every day. Do the little things right. You want to start your day off right? This is one of the things you do. You make your bed.
Wow. Yeah. So simple, but yet so effective, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Love that. So Caroline, if someone comes to you and because they have trouble like following through on their goals, they don't really have the grit that they want to have in their lives, what is kind of the first step or the process that you take them through to help them develop more grit in their lives?
Right. Good question. So in Getting Grit, I pretend someone who's reading it is my client, and I walk through exactly what I do. So the first thing people do is I have them take the VIA strengths test, find out what are your top 5 strengths. Are you using them effectively? What are your goals? Are your goals set the right way? And, you know, there's goal setting theory, and there's a lot of exercises to tease out, do you have the right goals? But then there are these other qualities that are all learnable, that are part of being gritty. One is patience. One is willpower, you know, self-regulation. One is having hope. Another one is about persistence, whether or not you can actually be a finisher. So people might have some of the right qualities in one area, but need to build them in other areas. So I have to take a look at somebody and get to know them to figure out what's missing. And so I think people can self-diagnose when they read my book, but I think it's important to figure out where they are right then. Are they pessimistic or are they optimistic? Are they able to finish hard things, or have they never even done hard things? Do they have a team around them? Are they in the right environment where other people are hopeful and hardworking or not? Because I think the fastest way to change anything about yourself is to change your environment. So one of the first things I do ask them is, who else wants you to succeed in your life? And are you around them enough? Because too many of us, particularly women, are surrounded by frenemies, friends who are enemies, who don't want you to succeed because they don't want you to stand out in any way. Because if you do, it disrupts the friendship and makes them ask themselves, wow, what's missing in my life? So you have to be really thoughtful about who makes the cut to be in your life.
Well, powerful takeaway. And really what we talked about before, right? Putting yourself in a team of excellence. I love the point also that you're making about kind of diagnosing your life and looking at really all these different areas, from perseverance to do you have the right goals even, right? I think that's one of the most challenging things for most people is, do you even chase the right things? And so really kind of looking at your life and diagnosing, like, what am I actually doing? What's going on? I think is very powerful.
Yes. I mean, you have to really sit down and ask yourself some very hard questions. And so there are a lot of good questions that are better than other questions that can really make you think harder. I assign everybody the best possible future self exercise, where you write about your life as if everything has gone as well as possible. What does that look like in 10 years? But another question that really can get to the heart of somebody's not living the life that they most want to live, which is called your ideal self, not your ought self or your actual self, but your ideal self, is, what will you regret not pursuing? If you're looking back on your life at some point and there's something left undone, what is that thing that you need to begin to pursue so that you can find out what you're made of and live your life without regrets? So, and it will involve risk taking, and it will involve vulnerability, and it will involve humility, and it's going to involve doing hard things. But, that question, what will you regret not pursuing, tends to always have an answer that gets to the heart of what somebody is here to do. What is their ikigai? What is their Japanese word for that which I wake up for? What are you here for? Because before you know it, you've run out of time. And then you're one of the people who in hospice care, they say the number one regret is that they lived someone else's life, not their own. So you don't want to be that person.
I love that. So make sure that you're actually living your life by design rather than by default, right? That you're not just responding to outside circumstances and where you were born and the kind of people that are in your life, but rather decide, like, those are the kind of people that I want to have in my life. Those are the circumstances that I want to have, and then kind of live into that each day.
Exactly. Okay, sorry, my desktop, which is hardwired, wasn't picking up on Google Hangouts for some reason.
Okay.
I love this topic, obviously, so I don't want to stop.
Oh yeah, I'm really loving this. Thank you so much.
Good. I mean, it's a great topic.
One very interesting question when it comes to grit is when to grit and when to quit. So when should we keep hustling through, deciding like, hey, I'm going to stick to this project, I'm going to see this through? And when is it time to say, actually, this is not moving me in the right direction?
Right. That's a great question, because there is a fine line between being a quitter and being someone who has the right kind of grit. And I find that the best answer I can give on that topic is that you need to be able to assess changed circumstances accurately. And that means that you have to be able to take in data from the environment, from other people. We need to have essentially the equivalent of a board of directors, and we seek out their advice and guidance about whether or not, let's say, as an entrepreneur, we miss the market and we need to pivot and maybe change the product or whatever it is that we're introducing. So you don't want to be so in love with your own goal or your dream of what you can create to the point where you're not able to assess a situation that no longer makes sense. So people with stupid grit will hurt themselves or other people in the process when they don't know how to quit. And I have a great quote in the book from Serena Williams, probably the greatest tennis player of all time, who says, I don't have any Control Alt Delete in me, meaning I can't just, I can't just stop. If something gets hard, I can't just stop. She says, so I have people around me, a manager. Now she has a husband, friends who care about her, her sisters, and she has empowered all of them to stop her when she's about to hit the wall and hurt herself and play through injury that she shouldn't be playing through. She's empowered them to say to her, you must stop, and she will listen. Wow. So you have to have that kind of humility again. Humility keeps coming up. The ability to give other people the power to know you and know your vision well enough that they will stop you when you're about to hurt yourself or other people. So people who have a lot of grit, and if I see perseverance in their top 5 strengths, one of the downsides or the dark sides of being somebody with perseverance is not knowing when to throw in the towel or pursuing other people's goals to the finish line because you're just a conscientious finisher. So you want to be really thoughtful about what are your goals versus someone else's goals, and do you need to empower other people to give you the sign that it's time to shut down because situation has changed. I watched a great documentary about Diana Nyad, who swam from Cuba to Key West. Oh, wow. And I think she only got there on her 5th try. And when you watch the documentary, the boat has like 32 people helping her. And she never wanted to stop. She never wanted to be pulled out of the water.
Oh, I believe
but that. Other people did pull her out during most of those other attempts because it was insane for her to keep going. So that's the point.
Oh, for sure. I love that. I was talking to Bill Ekstrom, founder of Excel Institute, the other day for this podcast. And he shared with me the story of like, anytime he makes a big decision in his life, he has this kind of tribe of like wise people, he called them, and basically calls them all together in one room. And they ask him these questions about, how do you want to live your life? Like, what do you really want out of this? And they really draw out those things out of him that on his own, he wouldn't be able to get out of himself. So just having those kind of people in your life that you can trust and you can confide in, they want the best for you is super powerful.
Well, and I think that's what's called a mastermind group, to be honest. I think a lot of people need to have a mastermind group of people who are not just friends, but people who have demonstrated a willingness and ability to be a giver, not just a taker, who are supportive of other people's dreams and goals. And unfortunately, a lot of people who should be happy for us when we strike out big or take risks or want to change the direction we're going in life, they are threatened by the fact that we are attempting to make a change or become better in some way or do something very hard because it disrupts the relationship and it might show them up. And so I find that women in particular need to have a mastermind group because too often, as I said, women have friends who are enemies and they're very close to them. And you want to have monthly business meetings with your mastermind group where you say, here are the goals I'm going for. Here are the challenges I'm expecting. What am I not seeing about myself? Ask me questions to make sure that I'm really thinking this through. And if you don't have that kind of team around you, get it today before the day is over, because it is a game changer in life to have a mastermind group.
Yeah, so get the right people for sure. So Caroline, in your own life, what are some things that you do on a daily basis to cultivate grit in yourself?
Oh, a really good question. So I went back to swimming after 20 years off at 40 and started swimming again, partly because zest is one of my top strengths and I'm inherently athletic. My great uncles went 1-2 in the 1912 Olympics. And so there's athleticism in my family. So the best Caroline always shows up when I have some kind of physical win first thing in the day, if possible. And so my best self is somebody who does something hard physically most days. So I'm trying to get another black belt now. It's going to be a multi-year effort. I'm a brown belt in another system that's very, very difficult. And I find that teaches me patience and persistence and humility in all the right ways. So I do the martial arts. I do swimming. I always work to uplift other people. I've started an initiative called Share 2 to 2 for women. where they share other women's success at their goals automatically. So instead of being stopped by jealousy or anger or whatever, just automatically twice a week share someone else's success to your social media networks. And that makes me feel better as well. I do what I love. I love what I do. I'm an executive coach. I teach in the Wharton Business School Executive Education Program about this. And I get to choose the clients I want to work with. So I construct my day in such a way where I get physical, emotional, spiritual, mental wins all day long. But I've built a circle around me of people who support and uplift me during hard times. And that's people by choice, not necessarily people by blood. And I got to walk the walk, because I can't just talk about what the research shows. I got to do it too. And those are some of the things that I choose to do on a daily basis.
Oh, for sure. And it really seems like you're walking the talk and actually living those principles and those lessons that you share with other people. So I'm really curious,
so.
what are some other habits or daily thoughts or behaviors that you do that have shaped your life the most?
More good questions. So one of the things that I found when I was writing the Grit book was that there's a mindset that is very particular to people with the right kind of authentic grit. And I found that they ask themselves, why not, instead of why. And I really try to live that way too. So when a challenge comes down the pike for me, instead of saying, well, why should I, or that's hard, I've tried to now just say, why not? Why not go for it? And I love the fact that I was listening to a podcast, and it may have even been Scott Barry Kaufman, which I think how you
that's how I found it.
Okay, so Scott's podcast is phenomenal, and
That's
so
amazing.
I'm pretty sure it was one of his interviews with someone who was talking about the book Man's Search for Meaning by Max Frankl, and that it originally was not called Man's Search for Meaning. In German, the original title was Nevertheless Say Yes to Life. And
wow, I didn't know that. I'm from Germany,
I
so.
didn't either. I mean, I tell you,
That's so
listen to Scott
interesting.
Barry Kaufman, it's like your brain is just, I listened to it 3 times. I take notes the third time. The second time, I'm not slack-jawed. I'm just fascinated. But, it's just when I heard that, nevertheless say yes to life, I thought that's exactly what people with the right kind of grit do. And I'm trying to do that. Instead of saying no, or it's too hard, or I don't have time, I say yes. And a perfect example of a time I said that to myself, and I think my life is better because of it, was I was dropping my youngest son off at college, and I was driving back home during his senior year, and I kept passing the Flight 91, I think it's 91 Memorial, in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, and that's where one of the planes was downed on purpose by the 37 passengers on 9/11 who realized they were part of a terrorist plot, and that the plane they were on was doing a U-turn to go back and hit the White House and literally take out our government. And those 37 passengers and 7 crew members gave their lives for our country. And I decided, instead of driving by the sign saying, Flight 91 Memorial, 30 minutes this way, I thought, why not? Of course I have enough time to go to this. Anything else doesn't matter. So I finally said, why not, instead of why. And when I got there, I was awed in a way I'm rarely awed. And that was speechless. I was speechless. There was nobody speaking at this national park, because it's on this windswept field, which is sacred ground now. You can't walk there unless you're a family member of one of the people who lost their lives. And you see, when you walk in, you see the news announcements from that day running in constant loops. And then you see, I get goosebumps saying this, you see this life-size mock-up of what the plane looked like that day, where everyone was sitting. And then there's 3 telephones right along this exhibit where they warn you, don't pick this up unless you're ready to hear what people left as messages to their loved ones in the last 90 seconds of their lives. And finally, after a lot of thought, I went and listened. And it's just amazing how, when you have 90 seconds to live, you reach out to the people you love. You're not thinking about yourself. You're thinking about your loved ones and what you want to say. And it's extraordinarily moving to be there. And instead of saying why that day, I said, why not? And I'm awed and inspired constantly by thinking about that national park, that memorial, those messages that I listened to, and really what true heroism is, what people will do when their lives are on the line, and how they were willing to go down fighting instead of going down like sheep once they realized they were part of this plot. So I'm glad I said why not that day, because I will never forget what they gave for our country that day.
Wow, that's such a powerful story. That is incredible. Yeah, I mean, I think just opening yourself up to possibilities and to the world, right? Like being willing to experience things that maybe out of your comfort zone that usually we don't incorporate in our lives, I think is very powerful.
Yeah. And you have to be curious. That goes back to why one of the top strengths of flourishing people is curiosity. Because when you're not curious, you're not learning anything. You're not even learning about other people. You're not, I feel like if you don't know other people's dreams and goals, you don't even know them. You might think you know them, but if you haven't had that kind of intimate conversation, you really don't know those people. How could you? I mean, it might even be your spouse. You might have financial goals, but you don't know what their emotional goals are. What's the legacy they want to leave behind? So I think that it's really important that we all be curious about what does life have to offer us? What can we learn from this person? You know, in the martial arts, we say you can learn from a white belt, not just a black belt. And that's true. And so be humble and curious, and your life will get better exponentially every single day.
Wow. So talking about learning from other people, if you could meet anyone from history, whether living or dead, who would it be and what would you say to them?
Oh, gosh. Such a good question.
Usually gets a lot of good answers. So.
I know, I bet you do, because I ask people a version of this question. I think I'm going to give you the answer I would give to this question. And the question I asked people was actually on the Stanford University application for admission a few years ago. And that was, if you could get on an elevator and it could go anywhere in a history, and it would open up on a scene that you most want to be part of or observe, where would it open up? The answer I give to that is probably the answer I would give to you. And that is, I would like to open up on Jesus giving his loaves and fishes sermon, where allegedly the fish were multiplied and the loaves were multiplied. Because what I want to know is, why did the world change so dramatically after that man died? What was it about him that's so different from so many other, self-proclaimed prophets that caused people to do hard things? He has Mount Rushmore grit. So I'd like to see his humility in action, what it was he said that made other people change their lives. So just to be up close and just hear what came out of his mouth, I think would inform my life in a really positive way. And I hope that's not a trite answer to your question.
Oh, no, I love that. Kind of seeing or living history in person. I love that.
I asked everybody I meet that question, and only one person in hundreds of questions has said that the elevator would open up on a scene in their current life. And I thought that was diagnostic in and of itself. But that I would want to learn humility and the power of vision if I could witness one of those sermons because of the impact it had on other people.
Well, I love that. I think what it also touches on is kind of what you're mentioning, is learning from other people. And I mean, there's so much incredible wisdom in history, right? I mean, even over the last 2,000 years or so, all those great philosophers in Rome and Greece back then, like Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, all of these amazing minds that they had so much incredible wisdom like 2,000 years ago. I mean, just imagining that. And oftentimes I think in today's society, that is kind of lost, and we don't acknowledge it. We don't appreciate all the amazing insights that like science is kind of showing, like all of the stuff that they were talking about 2,000 years ago was right. Like, I mean, all of those incredible things of whether it's meditation or gratitude or just all of these things, like they talked about 2,000 years ago. So I think it's just fascinating, like what we can learn from history.
Well, so Max, where would you go?
It's really interesting. I love Marcus Aurelius, like the great Roman emperor, just because like he wrote his book Meditations like 2,000 years ago, right? While he was fighting all over. And I think it was just interesting to kind of see, because he didn't intend to write it as a book. He intended to write it more as a personal letters to himself, right? So just kind of seeing and learning how he thought and how he kind of shaped, really the history of the world with a thinking like that would be really interesting.
Yeah.
And then also, secondly, I think a big part of this podcast is I want to meet Tony Robbins. That's kind of the end goal of this show. So,
that's interesting. So what are you hoping to learn from him?
You know, it's interesting. I mean, I've seen basically all his videos, listened to all his tapes, everything. But I think I would just want to learn more about like when he made that shift of like, because you know he was growing up very poor and very hard circumstances. So when he made that shift, like, and how he decided to really become now, I think the best motivational speaker in the world, and how he inspired so many people. I think it's just so fascinating. Just being around him for a moment, that would make my life. So
I hope you do. I mean, it will. It will be useful in so many ways, and I would imagine that's a doable goal. So, go for sure.
Yeah. Thank you. Love that. So, Caroline, how has a failure or apparent failure in your life set you up for later success? So, do you have any failures that actually propelled you forward later?
Oh, I have so many. Yes, I think if you're not failing, you're not taking enough risks, because it's only by tipping into failure that you know you've actually pushed yourself or your dreams or your goals or your actions. And so I think failing at overcoming my eating disorder by myself. I mean, I was kind of, I guess, half-hearted attempts, giving up, whatever. I mean, I tried for 8 years to overcome it, from 14 to 22, and couldn't do it. And so my failure was epic, because I lost so much. I lost my sport. I lost part of some very important components of my health. I almost couldn't have children. So that failure, if you call it a failure, was actually a huge success for me, because it taught me what I was made of. And it's my touchstone for everything else I do in life. If I could overcome that at a time when people weren't getting better and nobody knew how to get better, I can do this. My husband and I also started a company that was going to bring residential eating disorder treatment to the United States, if not the world. And wow. We went out on a limb and guaranteed all the loans, and we lost it all. We were homeless with an infant. Oh, wow. Then, but I mean, we went for it, and it ended up being just really one of the best things that happened to us. Because again, you find out who your friends are, you find out what you're made of, you find out what your marriage is made of, you find out what matters. And so all of those things help you to make meaning of your life. I mean, the other part of my brain is now clicking in with what the research shows. So the research shows that when you don't have enough significant failures or setbacks in life, and really the research shows between 3 and 7, you want to have at least 3 to 7 huge knocks in life where you don't get what you want. You are disappointed. Your life craters in some ways, because it's only by experiencing those kinds of losses that you appreciate the wins when you have them. And so too many breaks, is as dangerous as having too few breaks in life. So I think failures have really brought me to where I am today, and they keep me hungry for how can I become my best self today and every day and going forward.
Love that. I think one important point here really is that it's not during the easy times that we get better, but grit and self-discipline and self-control are all, we kind of create those and develop those in the hard times, right? Because when it's easy, then we don't have to develop grit. Like there's no way to develop grit when you're doing the same thing over and over and over again, easy, right? But when it's hard and when we have those setbacks, that's when like we're forced to really become a better version of ourselves. So I found that anyone that I talked to, really, it's the setbacks and the failures that actually made them better afterwards.
Well, it's true. As long as you approach those failures with a spirit of learning and curiosity, and there's something called double loop learning, where people who are willing to learn from failure are very ruthless about unpacking what didn't go well and learning from it. And too often people walk away from failures and they never touch it again. They don't want to relive it. They don't want to think about it. But if the goal is important enough to you, you owe it to yourself to unpack it and figure out what went well and where you went wrong. There's something also called the psychology of the near miss, which is very interesting. And that is that when people come close to accomplishing a goal, but they don't achieve it, you actually can become more excited about that goal instead of bagging it completely. So the psychology of the near miss says that a lot of people actually redouble their efforts when they get close, but they don't get the cigar, essentially. And I think that is grit. And that's one of the things that Angela Duckworth found in studying the finalists, even by the age of 12 at the National Spelling Bee here in the United States, because the finalists were the ones who didn't reach the final rounds earlier when they were 9 and 10 and 11, but they went back and they studied by themselves hard. They didn't need flashcards and parents doing things. They did the hard work, and they did a lot of it alone. And so I think those failures really teach you whether or not the goal is worthy of your focus and time going forward.
People want to connect with you online. What is your favorite way to connect?
I'm very findable, and it's email, caroline@carolinemiller.com. My website is carolinemiller.com. I love to hear from people, particularly their own stories of grit, stupid grit, selfie grit, faux grit, Mount Rushmore grit, ordinary grit. So email, caroline@carolinemiller.com. I also have Instagram, which is CM Coaching, and then my Twitter is Caroline M Coach. So please follow me, sign up for my newsletter. I have some video and my own podcast I'm launching at the end of the year. Slightly different focus than this, but I love to get feedback and I love to hear from people. So that's a good way to do it.
Awesome, especially those stories of stupid grit sound amazing.
Yeah, there's a great book I'm reading right now called Bad Blood, and it's about a company called Theranos, which has been in the news recently because this 19-year-old Stanford dropout bamboozled the entire venture world, a lot of supposedly smart people she became a billionaire on paper, and also she faked her results. It's like the VW emissions scandal, just cheating every which way to try to get money or fame or whatever it is. So there are examples everywhere, and I love this Theranos example of faux grit.
Wow, that sounds crazy. So my final question is, what does mental mastery mean to you?
To me, mental mastery is taking control of the parts of yourself that scream why, when you really do know that you should say why not and go for it, when it's a meaningful, important goal that gives your life purpose and focus. So the ability to compartmentalize and container the why part screaming at you so that you can physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually go for why not, to me, that's mental mastery.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. And thank you to everyone who tuned in to today's episode of Mental Mastery. Tune in daily for new episodes on how you can achieve mental mastery and live a happy and successful life. And if you would like a little extra push, head over to my website, maxweigand.com, for a free ebook on mastering self-discipline and willpower. There, you can also sign up for my one-on-one habit coaching program, where I help you master your habits and achieve your goals. Also, if you like this interview, feel free to rate and review the show. Until next time,